Welcome to Inside American Politics by Skoob, where we uncover the uncomfortable truths that shaped America. I'm your host, Bradley Teller, and today we're embarking on a journey that will challenge everything you thought you knew about slavery, freedom, and power in America. What if I told you that slavery wasn't invented in America? What if the very foundations of our democracy were built on a racial caste system? And what if, despite what your history books taught you, the abolition of slavery didn't actually end economic injustice, but simply transformed it? Over the next hour, we're going to explore 5 interconnected stories that reveal how slavery evolved from an ancient institution into the backbone of American society, and how its legacy continues to shape our world today. This isn't just history. This is the DNA of modern America. Let's start with a question that might surprise you. Was slavery actually invented by Europeans or Americans? The answer is a resounding no. Slavery predates the establishment of state entities themselves. Think about that for a moment. Before there were governments, before there were nations, before there were written laws, there was slavery. It's as old as sedentary living and grain cultivation, woven into the very fabric of human civilization. In pre-Columbian Latin America, anthropologist Fernando Santos Granaros documented extensive communal servitude practices that thrived long before European boots ever touched American soil. Among Native American tribes, slavery was commonplace, though often tempered by elements of integration and social mobility, a stark contrast to what would come later. But here's the staggering part. As recently as 1800, just over 200 years ago, approximately 75% of the global population lived in some form of bondage. 3 out of every 4 people on Earth were not free. Let that sink in. The renowned historian Moses Finley asked a provocative question. Was Greek civilization based on slave labor? His answer was an emphatic yes. In Athens, the supposed birthplace of democracy, slaves constituted around 2/3 of the population. The great philosopher Aristotle, whose ideas still influence us today, argued that certain people lacked rational capabilities and were naturally predestined for servitude, like draft animals. In Sparta, the situation was even more extreme. While Athens enslaved non-Greek war captives, Sparta imposed servitude on local helots, vanquished indigenous farmers whose labor sustained Spartan society. This was systematic appropriation of established agrarian systems for military benefit. The Roman Empire transformed the entire Mediterranean into a grand marketplace for human beings. Roman military expeditions were accompanied by merchants who profited from captured individuals. The Gallic Wars alone introduced nearly 1 million new slaves into the market. In Augustinian Rome, slaves made up 25% to 33% of the population. The value of a slave became a unit of measure. In classical Athens, 3 slaves could be traded for a pair of working mules. So when European colonizers arrived in America, they weren't inventing slavery. They were importing and industrializing a system that had existed for millennia. But what they would create in the New World would be uniquely brutal and racially defined in ways that ancient slavery never was. Now, let's journey to colonial America, where slavery would be transformed into something unprecedented in human history, a racial caste system that would define a nation. Initially, American plantation owners considered enslaving Native Americans, but this proved problematic. Indigenous tribes could resist and retaliate, instilling fear of raids among colonists. European immigrants weren't ideal candidates either, not because of racial reasons, but due to low numbers and the fact that slavery would deter voluntary immigration. Then plantation owners found their perfect solution: Africans. Brought over in large numbers, they were seen as relatively powerless in the New World, making them ideal targets for systematic enslavement. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. In early colonial society, the lines weren't as clearly drawn as you might think. Slaves occupied the lowest social rung, but indentured servants and many free whites lived in conditions only marginally better. The real enemy wasn't racial, it was class-based. The planter elite, with their vast land holdings, towered above workers of all ethnicities. This precarious balance exploded in the late 17th century with Bacon's Rebellion, an event that would fundamentally reshape American society. Nathaniel Bacon, a white landowner in Virginia, accomplished something that terrified the ruling class. He galvanized an unprecedented alliance of slaves, indentured servants, and poor whites, all unified against the planter elite. Picture this: black slaves and white indentured servants fighting side by side, demanding freedom from oppressive conditions. This multiracial coalition of the oppressed represented the plantation owners' worst nightmare. When the rebellion was crushed, several rebels were hanged, but the psychological damage to the elite was done. The planter elite's response was ingenious and diabolical. They implemented what would become known as a racial bribe, deliberately offering special privileges to poor whites to create a permanent divide between them and black slaves. White settlers received greater access to Native American lands. White servants could regulate slaves through patrols and militias, and restrictions prevented free labor from competing with slave labor. This strategy successfully eliminated future alliances between black slaves and poor whites. Although poor whites' circumstances barely improved, they derived psychological satisfaction from not being classified as slaves. The racial divide became a fundamental tool of population control. By the mid-18th century, America had transformed into a racial caste system centered on slavery. The justification was cloaked in pseudo-scientific beliefs that Africans were an inferior race, incapable of civilization. This white supremacy ideology conveniently rationalized continued enslavement precisely when ideologies of equality and liberty were supposedly being championed. Here's the bitter irony. Chattel slavery in America was fully established before democratic ideals were realized. The Constitution itself was designed around slavery. Although the words slave or Negro never appear in the document, it was fundamentally built on compromises that entrenched the racial caste system. Federalism, dividing powers between states and federal government, was the principal mechanism protecting slavery and slaveholding states' political authority. Even our electoral system was tailored to benefit slaveholders. The infamous 3/5 compromise defined slaves as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes, literally enshrining racist mythology at the core of American democracy. This wasn't a bug in the system, it was a feature. Let's talk numbers, because the economics of slavery will blow your mind and help you understand why it was so difficult to abolish. By the onset of the Civil War, the value of enslaved individuals as property exceeded the combined worth of all banks, factories, and railroads in the country. Think about that. Human beings as property were worth more than America's entire industrial infrastructure. In 1860, slaves constituted about 16% of total household assets in the United States. In today's terms, that's roughly $10 trillion. To put this in perspective, that's comparable to the value of carbon reserves that must remain unextracted globally to limit climate warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. Historian Greg Grandin emphasizes that slavery's economic significance extended far beyond unpaid labor profits. Slavery was the driving force behind America's market revolution, influencing economic activity not just in the U.S. but throughout the Americas. In the 18th century, Caribbean sugar plantations, entirely reliant on slave labor, were the most profitable segments of the British Empire, generating more revenue than all other colonies combined. The comparison between slavery and modern fossil fuel dependence is illuminating, though not perfect. Both represent economic systems so deeply embedded that their elimination threatens entire ways of life for those who profit from them. But here's where the story of abolition reveals a harsh truth about economic justice. The abolition of slavery marked one of history's greatest human rights victories. Approximately 800,000 people freed in British colonies, 4 million in the United States. But the economic struggle? That tells a very different story. Here's the cruel irony. When slavery was abolished, it was the slave owners, not the slaves, who received compensation. Local and international elites frequently secured substantial payments for their losses in human property, while former slaves received little to nothing. The most infamous example is Washington's failure to honor its post-Civil War promise of 40 acres and a mule to freed slaves. Instead, these lands were returned to former slave owners, who continued exploiting labor through sharecropping, a system that kept former slaves in economic bondage. Britain rewarded its slave owners with significant payouts during abolition, but France took this to an obscene extreme. They sent warships to demand that newly freed Haiti pay vast sums to compensate the French crown for lost enslaved workers under threat of attack. This was reverse reparations, former oppressors receiving compensation instead of the oppressed. This pattern reveals something crucial. While the legal right to own humans was eliminated, the economic structures that slavery created were largely preserved and transformed, not abolished. Now we arrive at perhaps the most controversial question. Has slavery truly been abolished, or has it simply evolved? Current studies reveal that slavery persists in over 40 countries worldwide, and surprisingly, the United States is among them. But we must recognize that slavery extends beyond physical ownership to include all forms of coercive control. When we examine modern urban America, troubling patterns emerge. Major cities that have been under single-party democratic control for decades continue to struggle with poverty, crime, and decay. Despite repeated campaign promises, little substantive change occurs, yet political support continues. This raises questions about whether economic desperation creates a form of political bondage. Consider financial debt as a modern form of economic subjugation. Many individuals find themselves trapped in debt cycles, laboring under burdens imposed by financial institutions, a situation that resembles economic servitude, though entered through personal choice. Addiction represents another form of control, where individuals become enslaved to substances. The illegal drug trade, often crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, generates substantial profits for criminal organizations while creating human trafficking situations that mirror historical slavery. When government regulations increasingly curtail civil liberties, dictate economic transactions, and control daily norms, they erode personal choice and freedom. The question becomes, at what point does legitimate governance become subtle enslavement? Let's examine the complex relationship between capitalism and freedom, a relationship that slavery helped define. Modern free market advocates frequently use freedom to champion capitalism. Americans celebrate their free enterprise system, with economists like Milton Friedman promoting the concept in works like Free to Choose. Think tanks publish indices measuring economic freedom, with organizations like the Heritage Foundation leading the charge. But here's the paradox. The freedom that free market advocates emphasize is often restricted to the economic realm. The liberty for businesses to operate as they choose, for workers to select occupations, for consumers to purchase without restriction. When other freedoms, political and social, conflict with economic freedom, free market economists typically prioritize the latter. This was evident in Milton Friedman and Friedrich von Hayek's support for General Pinochet's authoritarian regime in Chile. Despite Pinochet's brutal dictatorship, they backed him because he implemented free market policies, viewing economic liberty as more important than political freedom. Within this framework, property owners' rights to maximize financial returns take precedence over other economic liberties. Labor rights to organize, strike, or benefit from welfare systems are considered counterproductive if they impede property owners' rights. Historically, when humans were considered property, as enslaved Africans were, their lack of freedom was violently enforced to protect slave owners' economic rights. Over the past 150 years, capitalism has become more humane by placing limitations on property owners' economic freedoms. Society developed institutions protecting political and social freedoms when they conflict with economic freedoms: democratic constitutions, human rights laws, protest protections, labor rights, welfare systems, and environmental regulations. The story reveals intricate relationships involving enslaved Africans, Native Americans, indentured Asians, European plantation owners, and settlers. This complexity contrasts sharply with simplified portrayals offered by free market advocates. As we near the end of our journey, let's consider how slavery's legacy continues shaping modern America. The racial caste system created to manage slavery didn't disappear with abolition. It adapted. Jim Crow laws, redlining, mass incarceration, and countless other systems perpetuated economic and social hierarchies rooted in slavery's original design. The racial bribe that prevented poor whites and enslaved blacks from uniting continues influencing American politics. Economic anxiety among working-class whites is often channeled into racial resentment rather than class solidarity, preventing unified action against economic inequality. The constitutional compromises that protected slavery, federalism, the Electoral College, Senate representation, continue shaping American governance, often in ways that preserve existing power structures. Understanding this history is crucial because it reveals that many problems we face today aren't accidents or natural occurrences. They're features of systems designed centuries ago to maintain control and extract wealth. We've journeyed across centuries, from ancient bondage to the systems that helped shape modern America, and uncovered a difficult truth. Slavery wasn't an anomaly, it was foundational. Its abolition ended the law, but not the structures that echoed through economics, power, and inequality. Understanding this isn't about dwelling on the past. It's about recognizing how history still breathes through the present. And what if the stories left untold reveal even deeper connections, hidden choices, and consequences that still shape lives today? There's far more beneath the surface than we've explored here. Download the Skoob app now to get access to the full story and uncover the history that challenges what you thought you knew.